Hello, everybody, and welcome to the London History Podcast. I'm Hazel Baker, your host. Today marks a very special episode as we celebrate World Dracula Day on the 26th of May, the anniversary of the publication of Bram Stoker's legendary novel in 1897. And I couldn't think of a better guest to explore London's Victoria vampire connections than David Turnbull. Hello, David.
Hello, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you. Now, for those who haven't heard David before, now he is a Lambeth tour guide. He leads an absolutely fascinating collection of tours, including our History of Horror walking tour, our Jekyll and Hyde, our Scientists and Monsters one, all available on londonguidedwalks.co.uk. So if you haven't experienced any of those, I can highly recommend them because what's so wonderful is David taking you on an atmospheric journey through the darker corners of London's past. And he's the perfect person to do it because he's also a Gothic writer. And so his novel, The Hurdy-Gurdy Man, available from Nightmare Press, this also draws from that same Victorian horror traditions that we'll be discussing today. What I think will make this conversation particularly compelling, David, is that you're going to draw, I think, a connection between some of those literary dots. So Byron's Circle, Penny Dreadfuls, the theatrical world at the Lyceum, and get a bigger picture, I think, of what maybe there are the perceptions that we know and really what there has been to discover.
Yeah, I think there was a big prequel of nearly 100 years leading up to Dracula with vampires popping up in all sorts of different forms and gradually building this notion of the aristocratic vampire that we're so familiar with today.
Before we get into the bloodthirsty details, I'm fascinated. What drew you to this particular corner of London's Gothic history?
I think it was probably growing up watching the Hammer horror films and how they depicted the dark, foggy streets of London with all sorts of things going on in the shadows and monsters and vampires. And then, really, from that, um, going and discovering the novels from which all of that stuff originated. So, yeah, Hammer horror played a big part in my youth. Friday night horror movie on BBC was always the big favourite.
I'm sure that someone listening to my introduction would have said, World Dracula Day, what on earth is that? So do share, how on earth did it come about and what does it involve exactly?
So Dracula, as people may know or may not know, has a big connection with Whitby in Yorkshire because that's where the ship that brought him to the UK went ashore at Whitby. And Stoker had spent a few nights in Whitby and the atmosphere of Whitby Abbey in its ruins and all of that had sunk into his DNA. So the Whitby Dracula Society launched the Global Dracula Day in 2012 to mark the anniversary of the novel's publication. And it is celebrated every year in different parts of the world with different people doing different things, dressing up in vampire and Dracula costumes, readings of the novel in local libraries, some performances of the Dracula play. I know Derby, which is another big Dracula city, because that's where the Dracula stage play was first performed back in the 1920s. They have lots going on. And a few years ago, there was a Guinness record broken in Whitby for the highest number of people dressed in Dracula costumes congregated around the Whitby Abbey. I think it's 1,360 or more people and got themselves into the Guinness Book of Records. So it's all a bit of fun, really, but I'm really paying tribute to what is probably the best known of all of the Gothic novels to be written in the Victorian era.
I'm trying to imagine all those people in Whitby, because when I went, there was someone at the Abbey standing in front of the light and creating ghoulish shadows on the wall. And yeah, what a perfect place to capture anyone's
Yeah.
imagination, whether it's nowadays or
And they have a
Victorian.
Dracula museum out on the seafront as well.
So while Whitby has a key role in the novel, undeniably, you could say that maybe London was the spiritual home of both, maybe like Victorian literacy in terms of the vampire and also the Dracula as the novel. What would you
Yeah, I mean,
say?
we spoke about the romantic poets, Byron, and people like that, and really, I think that could be said to where the story starts, because a lot of those poets were writing Gothic poetry and introducing characters who may not have been as clearly defined as vampires as we see them today, but had vampiric traits and tendencies. And Byron lived for a year in Piccadilly, 139 Piccadilly. And he invited a close friend of his, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, to come to his house one day. And Coleridge read him a poem that he had written called Christabel. And Christabel features a potentially vampiric character called Eleanor, who makes her way into the life of this young woman, Christabel. She has a vampire trait because she can't cross the doorstep of Christabel's father's house, and Christabel has to carry her over the doorstep. So, in vampire lore, a vampire can't enter your home unless you invite it in. So she carries Eleanor over the doorstep as her father's mastiff hound howls in terror. So you can see the kind of beginnings of the vampire lore and trait coming into play in that poem. And Byron was so impressed by it that he got his own publisher, John Murray, to publish Christabel, which no doubt helped Coleridge Taylor's career immensely. And he did his own reading of Christabel at the famous Villa Diodata on the shores of Lake Geneva on that very dark summer when volcanic eruptions had darkened the skies and rain was falling and storms were howling. And there was a gathering in that villa with a famous ghost story challenge, where Frankenstein by Mary Shelley was famously written. But Byron did a recital of Christabel that was so evocative that Percy Shelley ran out of the room screaming in terror at the images that brought to his mind. And there's another bit of vampire lore connected to that summer, because Byron's own contribution to the ghost story writing competition didn't have a title. He called it The Fragment of a Novel. And it featured an aristocrat called Augustus Darvell, who goes traveling in the East and dies on his travel, to be seen later in the story, risen from the dead, alive and well in London. So you can see again how all this, these little building blocks that led to Dracula, are starting to take place around about that time.
I think it must have been a feeling in that surrounding as well. So you've got all these wonderful, brilliant minds. You've got the darkness then closing in. It must have kind of felt like the end of the world.
It was quite apocalyptic, and Shelley's other novel, The Last Man in the World, kind of picks that up as well. So I'm sure all of that came into play: the poetry, the darkness, the ominousness of the volcanic ash in the sky and weather. All of that kind of must have played into their imaginations.
And if anybody has a spare £29.95 million, then you can buy Lord Byron's house, which is for sale. I'll put a link in the show notes, because then you can have a look at the pictures as well. And that is certainly a library that I would love to have.
Well, next door to his house, 138, that is thought to have been the role model for Dracula's house in London. So in the novel, his London residence is 347 Piccadilly. Piccadilly doesn't go up that far, but from the description, a number of literary scholars have placed it at 138. So right next door to Byron's house, of a fitting place for it to be. And Piccadilly comes into play. There's a couple of characters, Lord Godalming and Abraham Van Helsing. They're in hotels at either end of Piccadilly. And this is where they plan to bring down Dracula by going into his house and blessing the soil that he has brought from Transylvania in order that he can't return there at night. There's supposed to be 8 crates in the house. Turns out they only find 7. But then makes an appearance and mocks them, saying that he's already tasted the blood of Mina Harker before disappearing out of the window. So quite a fitting place next door to Byron's house for all of those goings on to be taking place.
It's all happening, isn't it? Now, you also mentioned John Murray, the publisher of Byron, who is also Jane Austen's publisher.
Absolutely. And he published a Scottish author called James Hogg, who was a shepherd, and he was discovered by Walter Scott. But he wrote a really good Gothic novel called The Confessions of a Justified Sinner, which is thought to be one of the inspirations behind The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So again, a lot of these Gothic connections coming into play.
When you think of Gothic, you don't necessarily think about Piccadilly and, the square within Mayfair. You often think maybe of Soho as well.
Yeah, I mean, Soho again in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that's Mr. Hyde's hunting ground as he prowls through the dark streets of London. It's obviously quite famous as the headquarters much later of Hammer Horror. Hammer House was in Wardour Street. But before that, somebody else who was in the villa in Geneva lived there. It was John Polidori, who lived at 39 Great Pulteney Street. He was Byron's surgeon as a very young man. And he'd been at the villa. I think the story he wrote was something about a floating skull that didn't go down very well with the other more experienced writers. But he did later, when he'd fallen out with Byron, write his own classic piece of vampire literature, which is considered to be very important in terms of the development, and that is The Vampire, which he kind of based on Byron's fragment of a novel, and had a little bit of a pop at Byron by basing the villain, Lord Riven, on Byron himself. And that became hugely popular, particularly in France, where there was no less than 4 stage plays produced shortly after its publication. One of the people who went to see that play was the author of The Three Musketeers, Alexandre Dumas. And he wrote about the impact that play had on him in his memoirs. And it also brought him to write his own vampire story. So you can see that influence beginning to have a global impact as well. There was an English version of the play by James Planch, and that was actually put on at the former Theatre Royal, which is now the London, which has loads of Dracula connections that we'll get on to later. The star of that play was a guy called T.P. Cook, who had performed in Equestrian Circus across the bridge in Waterloo, and he played Lord Ruthven in a kilt, because part of the plot takes place in Scotland, and that was quite a popular play. T.P. The Frankenstein stage play also starred T.P. Cook. He played Frankenstein's monster, and Mary Shelley was in the audience and suitably impressed at how he interpreted her monstrous creation.
What a fantastic thing to see your creation come alive on stage from the words in a book, but also how terrifying for her and how terrifying for him to know she's sitting there.
Yeah, I know. Can you imagine? I'm going to be performing this in front of the author of the novel.
Yeah.
He was identified on the program as question mark. They didn't start calling the Frankenstein's monster the monster until much later. So it was a nameless creature to start with.
I always feel sorry for poor Polidori, for his pitiful end, I suppose, more than anything else.
Yeah, what was he, 26 when
Mm.
he died? Yeah. But there was a near neighbor of his who revived the vampire a few years after his death as a penny dreadful. So in Little Pulteney Street, there was a publisher called Benjamin Douglas Cousins who used to publish penny dreadfuls, and he published a version of Polidori's work with suitably horrific and graphic illustrations to accompany that publication.
Fantastic. And anybody, if this is kind of like, floating your boat, then we do the Scientific Secrets and Literary Legends tour, and we do cover Polidori. It's right around the corner from where the Shelleys lived as well. I mean, when you start mapping London out, you can kind of see the influences just where people were spending their time. So that's a good
Yeah,
one to
there's all
explore.
sorts of connections going on around there, isn't there?
Yeah. So if we move towards Fleet Street and talk about penny dreadfuls, but
Yeah, so like I said, the vampire came out as a penny dreadful, but the real king of the penny dreadfuls was Edward Lloyd. He was so famous that the music hall artist Marie Lloyd took her name from him because she said everybody knows Lloyd's magazine, so that would be a good name for me to have if I want to be famous. But he had an editor and a contributor called Elizabeth Gray, who worked very closely with him. And he published a serialization of one of her works called The Skeleton Count. Count Rudolph makes a deal with the devil for immortality. But the downside of the deal is that when the sun goes down every night, he turns into a skeleton and only lives in flesh and blood during the day. He becomes quite lonely in his immortality, so he uses alchemy to turn a local girl into a vampire. Unfortunately, she goes out at night and preys on local children, which results in what became quite a classic image from the later Universal and Hammer movies of the peasants of the village marching on the castle with flaming torches and burning the castle to the ground. So Count Rudolph is left to spend eternity alone. But then probably the most famous of Edward Lloyd's vampire stories and gain a huge influence on Stoker was Varney the Vampire, who becomes a vampire during the English Civil War. And really, most of the story is him plaguing this family and their daughter. It goes on for pages and pages and episodes and episodes. It was a huge tome. It's thought to have either been written by Malcolm Reiner or Thomas Peckett Prest, who were two of the main writers for Lloyd. But Elizabeth Gray may have had a hand in it as well, because Lloyd never credited his writers. Both Reimer and Peckett Prest are thought to have been either both or individually responsible for another one, Sweeney Todd, the Demon Barber.
Like round the corner
Fleet
from
Street.
Salisbury Court.
Absolutely, yeah. So Varney comes to quite a tragic end. He decides that immortality is not for him, and he throws himself into the molten lava of Mount Vesuvius as the only way he can figure of destroying himself. But again, you can see this idea of Immortal wandering the world, which again comes into play with Stoker's novel much later on in the century.
Idea of being trapped in foreverness. I mean, that kind of reminds me of the, was it 2014 Dracula Untold with
Yeah,
Charles Dance and Luke Evans, and that whole like, well, I can't die unless I pass this on. You know, there's nothing kind of, and just, I mean, and also if you think, if you've ever marched up to Mount Vesuvius, you know, there's just a big dark blackness of a mouth. You know, you're like, are you ever going to get to the lava? So there's not necessarily a
yeah,
guarantee
yeah.
that it's going to succeed at all. And I was thinking when you talk
Well, I don't think that would have mattered to the Penny Dreadful writers. They were just looking for
bin,
melodrama,
yes,
and
just throw me into the mouth of Vesuvius. And it's also
yeah,
that when you were talking also about it reminded me about, you know, doing a deal with the devil, and it was very Faust, wasn't it? And this was just happening at the same
yeah,
time.
yeah.
And also then being trapped with those decisions that you have obviously made, but there are always the small print that you never read.
Yeah. And I think immortality would be a bit of a drag eventually, wouldn't it? If you've been everywhere, seen everything, done everything,
Yes, we
and
don't.
you have to rise from your coffin every night to try and hunt down somebody to drink their blood,
Yes,
become quite tedious, wouldn't it?
it would. And also, it reminds me of also Interview with a Vampire when, oh, what's in it? And she's the little girl, but she's not a little girl. She's just in a little girl's body. You know, that
Yeah,
would be, I think, even worse.
to be trapped like that forever.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Anyway,
Even though your mind is growing up,
yes,
you're still trapped as a child. Yeah,
exactly. And everyone sees you as a child.
exactly. Yeah,
Oh, just awful. All right, so if
yeah.
we stick on, like, it's so fascinating. So if we stick with the Fleet Street connections, then, because there's the illustrated magazine Dark Blue.
So Dark Blue was kind of the successor to the Penny Dreadfuls was the illustrated magazines, but they quite often went in for horror and melodrama and gothic fiction in a serialized form, again with illustrations. And Dark Blue published another important vampire novel, Carmilla, by Sheridan Le Fanu, a Dublin-born writer, and it introduced, quite scandalous for the Victorian era, the notion of the lesbian vampire, which had been kind of hinted at earlier in Christabel, Samuel Coleridge Taylor's poem, but was more explicitly expressed in Carmilla. It also introduced the notion of the supernatural detective, somebody who sets out to track down these monsters. So Martin Heselius in that novel is kind of a precursor to Professor Abraham Van Helsing in Dracula.
You mentioned about Sheridan Le Fanu being and the Dublin, and he's born in Dublin, but wasn't Bram Stoker born in Dublin as well?
Yeah, Bram Stoker was born in Dublin, and he's said to have been quite taken by Carmilla, and that stuck in his mind quite a lot. It was also where he met Henry Irving. He had
Didn't know.
he had followed his father into working at Dublin Castle. He was a clerk at Dublin Castle, but he had ambitions to be a writer. So he was kind of moonlighting as a theatre critic for a paper in Dublin. And he wrote quite a positive review of Henry Irving's performance in a play in Dublin. Henry Irving then invited him to come and have dinner with him, and they became firm friends. And I think they probably met 2 or 3 times more whenever Henry Irving was in Dublin, and then they began corresponding with each other, which eventually led to when Irving took over the Lyceum, him inviting Stoker to come over to London and become his theatrical manager in the Lyceum.
You go. You see, I knew he was the theatre manager of the Lyceum for Irving, but I didn't know the story a little bit before and how they connected. So that's great, joining
Yeah,
those
yeah,
dots. And
yeah.
when he was working at the Lyceum with all that darkness and eeriness and creaking, that he wrote Dracula, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Lyceum did put on quite a few melodramas, particularly ones starring Henry Irving himself. But there was the Jekyll and Hyde stage play that they put on around about the same time as the Jack the Ripper murders were taking place, and the actor who played Jekyll and Hyde very successfully was at one point
He was on the
accused of
list.
being Jack the Ripper.
Mm.
Yeah, but they Irving appeared in the Flying Dutchman, which was a ghost story. And you mentioned Faust. They put on a version of Faust where he played Mephistopheles. And again, this is said to have fed into Stoker's description of Dracula. But there was also what he called the beefsteak room at the back of the Lyceum, where they would hold literary dinners and luncheons, and they would invite people like Oscar Wilde and all those novelists who were around in the late Victorian era. And all of that started to seep into Stoker's thinking. And there was a couple of quiet meetings that took place in the beefsteak room between Stoker and a couple of people who seemed to have helped shape Dracula. So the first one was with the explorer Richard Burton, who was the translator of Arabian Nights and the Kama Sutra. But he'd also written a series of interlinked stories called Vikram and the Vampire, which was based on a traditional Indian story where Prince Vikram encounters this creature in a graveyard, which is a demon that has possessed a bat hanging down from a tree, and forces him, a bit like Arabian Nights, to tell different stories over a period of time. So another person that he was invited to the beefsteak room was somebody who sounds like he could be a character from Harry Potter. His name was Professor Arminius Vambry, and he was a professor at the University of Budapest. And he wrote a lot about Transylvanian folklore and the kind of things that would go on with werewolves and vampires and traditional beliefs. And these seem to have struck a chord with Stoker. And they corresponded for almost a decade after they first met. And again, this is thought to be where Professor Van Helsing has his origins. So all of that was kind of churning away in Stoker's mind and kind of leading to this fantastic novel that he would eventually write.
So Stoker, I mean, he did his own research before writing his novel, didn't he?
Yeah, I mean, he spent a lot of time in the British Museum looking at Transylvanian culture and artifacts from history that might feed into his story. But one of the places he spent a lot of time was the London Library, and they've done their own research in the library, and they found at least 27 books which have notes in the margins and little marks under certain words or phrases that they've been able to verify from looking at Stoker's notebooks that they are in his handwriting. So a couple of ones that are well notated is The History of Werewolves by Sabine Baring Gould, who's kind of more famous as he was a vicar, and he's more famous as the composer of Onward Christian Soldiers, the Salvation Army's anthem. But he wrote this novel about werewolves and other creatures, particularly going into the territory of Professor Vambry and looking at Eastern European traditions. And that one is said to be include the most notes from Stoker. So you can see how he was delving into this quite heavily and getting all his ideas about the background to Dracula and building up his story. The other book is by a travel writer called Charles Bonner, who wrote a travel book about his travels in Transylvania. And some of it is more or less lifted straight out and put into Dracula. So the first few chapters are Jonathan Harker traveling through Transylvania and describing the dark woods and the mountain passes and the little villages. And it is kind of just lifted straight out of Charles Bonner's accounts of his travels, because Stoker himself never visited Transylvania or Romania or the Carpathian Mountains, but these
You wouldn't know that,
descriptions were
would you,
so
Lou?
vivid.
That's it. You wouldn't know
Yeah,
it, would you? I mean, when you're reading it, I remember I first read it when I was 14, and you did feel like you were traveling through in a rickety carriage through, so you wouldn't have any clue that he had never been there himself.
yeah, and I mean, I think it's all credit to Charles Bonner, who obviously wrote very well about his visits in a way that Stoker himself could actually imagine exactly what Transylvania was like without ever having been there.
So, if we continue with London's connections to Dracula, and we've done Piccadilly, but where else are we going?
So London Zoo is one place. London Zoo, Dracula releases a wolf from its cage called Seduce and turn Lucy
Lucy.
Westrana into a vampire. He has it jump through her window and frighten the servants and the maids and everything like that. And obviously Hampstead Heath is where the Westrana family have their house. Highgate Cemetery turns up, although he doesn't call it Highgate Cemetery. King's Cross Station is where all these crates of soil that have the soil from Transylvania that Dracula needs to rest in during the sunlight hours, they're all delivered to King's Cross and then sent out to various locations. So, as we've already said, some of them go to the house in Piccadilly, some of them go to East London, and a few of them go over the other side of the water to Walworth. So, obviously, Stoker was living in London at that time. He'd been in London for maybe 15 years at that time, so he was very familiar with the area. He was living himself at 18 St Leonard's Terrace, where there is a plaque on that house. So he was dropping in places that he was familiar with, rather than what he did with Transylvania, relying on somebody else's writing.
And was Dracula like an immediate hit when it was first published?
It's more of a slow burner. It did do quite well, but the novel that outsold it came out in the same year. So Dracula came out on the 26th of May, 1897, which is why, as we said, there is World Dracula Day. It's published by Archibald Constable and Company, who were based in Westminster, so another London connection there. And it kind of bucked the trend, because we were speaking about illustrated novels. And it was very, very common at that time for novels to come out in serialized versions before they were published as novels. And there was the famous Strand magazine was located just behind the Lyceum, famous for the Sherlock Holmes stories. But it bucked the trend by coming out as a novel first. But its rival, The Beetle by Richard Marsh, had come out around about the same time as a serialized illustrated magazine story. By September of that year, it was so popular that it came out as a novel. and it outsold Dracula 6 times over. And it's quite similar to Dracula because it's told from the viewpoint of different characters. It's about a supernatural entity who comes to London. In this case, either a beetle that can become a human or a human that can become a beetle. It's never quite clear. But it can also change sex. Sometimes it's a woman, sometimes it's a man. And that, like I said, it outsold Dracula 6 times over. Beat Dracula to the punch in terms of becoming a stage play. And also beat Dracula to the punch in terms of becoming a silent movie.
Why do you think that
So,
was?
yeah, I mean, I think obviously that there was all this stuff with Tutankhamun and things like that, and Egyptology and all of that was coming into play. So I think that kind of captured the public's imagination. And Stoker's next novel after Dracula has an Egyptian supernatural character, the Jewel of the Seven Stars. And he actually acknowledged that Richard Marsh's novel was a big influence in that.
So, what do you think Dracula owes its rise to prominence in the 20th century and beyond? Then, what was it?
Well, I think it is down to another Irishman, also from Dublin, born in the same area as Stoker, a bit younger than him, but his mother knew Stoker's mother. And I think probably it was that relationship that led to Hamilton Dean becoming part of Henry Irving's troupe at the Lyceum. And he was very taken by Dracula himself. And he wrote the famous Dracula stage play in the 1920s. There had been a legal case after Stoker died, where the film Nosferatu, German film, Florence Stoker had sued the makers of that film successfully because she said it was an unauthorized portrayal of her husband's novel. So when Hamilton Dane wrote the play, he obviously wanted to avoid any litigation, and he took it to Florence Stoker, who gave it her blessing. That went on to be a highly successful play. As I said earlier, I had a premiere in Derby, had a successful tour of the UK, no less than 4 West End runs. Quite amazing when you think of that. Was then adapted on Broadway, and it was in Broadway that a Hungarian actor called Bela Lugosi was cast as Dracula, which then led him to be the first screen Dracula in Universal Pictures' classic 1931 movie. So I think it was really the stage play that revived the interest, and the film then made Dracula a global character. He's now the most filmed literary character in history. And there was a nice little incident at the Lyceum when Hamilton Dean revived the Dracula play, because he brought it to the Lyceum for its revival in 1939. And Bela Lugosi, who was then famous as Dracula, was in London filming a film called Dark Eyes of London. And at the end of the performance, Hamilton Dean announced that Bela Lugosi was in the audience. Hamilton Dean was playing Dracula himself, and he invited Bela up onto the stage, and the two Draculas shook hands to rapturous applause from the audience.
Like happy stories. And what is
Yeah.
it about the Guinness World Record about Dracula?
So that was the number of portrayals of Dracula in the cinema. He holds the world record for the highest number of cinematic portrayals. And then if you include radio plays, television adaptations, it goes even higher. And even computer games as well. So he's kind of really way beyond. I think Sherlock Holmes might be second. Yeah, I've got a feeling Sherlock Holmes might be second, but Dracula's way ahead of the of the pack in terms of number of films being made, and not just English-speaking films. When they made Dracula in the Universal Studios, it was just when talking pictures were starting to take hold, and they hadn't figured out dubbing or subtitles. So the film studios used to make second language pictures using the same film sets. And there was a Spanish language Dracula filmed at the same time with a Spanish actor who looks very like Bela Lugosi, using the same costumes and sets. So there's two Dracula films by Universal that came out at the same time.
They must have been pretty sure it was going to do well then, to basically make
well, I
two
think
films.
they were hedging the bets. Either the English version or the Spanish version had a chance of making a return. But obviously, the success of Dracula then led to Universal for the next 20 years being the main studio producing horror films.
Mentioned about your own London horror novel, The Hurdy-Gurdy Man. Put it up so people can see, because it's lovely artwork.
So this is The Hurdy-Gurdy Man.
Yeah.
As you said, now available from Nightmare Press. And
Any
it's
inspiration
a Gothic
from Dracula?
novel. It's quite influenced by Dracula. I mean, it's a Gothic novel, but it's set in 1969 in swinging London. But I would say there's quite a lot of Dracula seeped into it. So, but in this novel, he is a middle-aged, hippie, eccentric aristocrat, son of a Scottish lord who lives in London. He has the power to mesmerize people and other supernatural elements as well. And then a blood drinker. But he lures homeless young women to his crumbling mansion on Hampstead Heath, which again is a bit like Dracula's castle. So at the beginning of Dracula's castle, Jonathan Harker can't figure a way out. He's like a prisoner in that castle. And these women end up being prisoners in the Hurdy-Gurdy's man's house. And they have to figure out a way to bring him down. So it starts off in Piccadilly, appropriate enough, and then the action moves to Hampstead Heath. And again, a bit like Dracula, where different characters have to join forces to try and bring the evil of Dracula down. These unfortunate women have to then join forces and work out a way to bring down the Hurdy-Gurdy man and make their escape from his house.
Happy stuff.
He gets his comeuppance in the end without spoiling anything.
Don't spoil it
so-
yet. We don't spoil it. Give me something to read and look forward to. All right, so for those who want to know a little bit more about the book, it's actually going to put all the links in the show notes. And also, if you want to continue listening on your podcasting journey, then episode 142 of the London History Podcast, Monsters and Myths of London, talks about a number of things, including fire-breathing demons, medieval spectral hounds, and also a vampire hunt in the 1970s. So bringing it all back to the theme of a Dracula today. So, David, thank you so much for bringing London's Dracula to our ears.
And happy Dracula Day.
Happy Dracula
Just
Day.
Make sure you've got your crucifixes and cloves of garlic ready, just in case.
I got a few silver bullets too. Thanks for joining us on the London History Podcast. Until next time.